So we have another nice project now, another case study. It's called Offshore. And now was France, and before was the time for France, and now it's the turn for Canada, of course, the two major actors in interactive documentary. We have with us from Canada, Brenda Longfellow. She's a teacher at York University and transmedia filmmaker from Canada. She's an award-winning filmmaker whose documentaries have been screened and broadcast internationally, winning prestigious awards. For example, in 2013, she launched the interactive documentary Offshore, which is not an interactive documentary anymore, it's a transmedia documentary, I think, but you will explain deeply. She teaches in the Department of Cinema and Media Arts at York University and has published articles on documentary and feminist film. On the other hand, Mike Robbins is creative technologist and a partner at Helios Design Labs, where he has been for the last 15 years. He oversees the interactive part of Helios' creative output, and recent projects that he has worked on include Kipu, Digital Me, After the Storm, the high-rise series, Offshore, 7,000 Islands, among others. The work has collectively won a number of major awards and nominations. So it's a pleasure for us, finally, to have Brenda and Mike again here at InterDocs. Let's give a big hand.
Where do you want to start?
I just want to start by saying hola, and thank you to Arno for inviting us to showcase Offshore. Offshore has been a really fascinating and rich collaboration, and I think David was kind of alluding to this earlier, that you can't do an interactive documentary without working with incredibly creative web designers, and that's been the collaboration that I've had with Mike for the last several years. This project has taken several iterations. We actually showed a very preliminary prototype version at Nuit Blanche in Toronto in 2013, and Nuit Blanche is an all-night art party, where we did a sound installation using sound that we'd gathered from offshore oil rigs and then did a talk around it. We launched the first iteration of the web documentary in 2014. We launched the global international version the next year, and we've just premiered the VR version at Hot Docs in 2016. So I think Mike is going to just show a little bit of the VR version and the prologue, and then we'll talk a little bit about the kind of conceptual and design evolution of the project, and hopefully have time to navigate a bit through it.
Okay. Right. Actually, here. Oh, one sec. The suspense is killing you. Okay, so actually what we're going to show here is actually the web version of, or actually the presentation version of the VR version of the Offshore. And there's not really a difference between the two, so 3 or 4. So we're just going to start in on that. Just as an introduction to the project. So we're in the middle of somewhere. There's sound. Yeah. Let's begin. Hopefully. now we can enter the VR, and now we're going to talk about other stuff.
Okay.
Before we come back to this.
So this was my first interactive project, and it had actually begun when I got a grant to do something about the Deepwater Horizon. I was originally proposing to do it as a documentary opera. That I'd been making environmental films for several years, including linear documentaries, and I was getting more and more dissatisfied with that form, and really wanted to push the boundaries of how we could begin to start talking about environmental issues. Very quickly realized that the documentary opera and the Deepwater Horizon disaster, it just wasn't gelling. And we'd become very interested in interactive, and of course knew the work of Helios with High Rise and numerous other projects, and that's what really began this process. But Offshore, I think, was a response to having worked in linear environmental filmmaking and following a kind of very conventional, traditional narrative where you outline the issues, you propose certain kind of solutions, and you expect people to come along with you. But increasingly, it just seemed that that was a very limited way to start addressing some of the most complex questions of the 21st century. So Offshore evolved as a kind of provocative thought exercise that began with the question, what if the future was not going to hold some promise of a massive shift away from fossil fuels, but might very well involve the catastrophic burning of every last drop of oil and gas wrenched from every crack and crevice in the planet? What if the frontiers of oil exploitation became more extreme and our petro-modernity just kept proliferating and reproducing itself? So this question was sparked by the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon on April 20th, Earth Day 2010, which, as everyone knows, instantly killed 11 workers and ended up spewing more than 5 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico, the largest environmental disaster in history. The blowout from BP had a complex provenance that lawyers, activists, commentators, etc. are still arguing over. It's about global capital and the particular culture of cost-cutting that infected BP and Halliburton. It's about the technological hubris of these multinationals who assumed that a worst-case scenario would never happen and who wrote oil spill responses on the back of a napkin. It's about crony capitalism and the sordid story of the Minerals Management Service, the federal bureau charged with regulating the oil industry, whose stalwarts, when they weren't enjoying sex and cocaine parties with the oil industry, were busy rubber stamping oil inspections. But I think on some deep and kind of mythic level, it was also about the humiliation and materialization of our toxic dependency on oil. When the Deepwater happened, we quickly realized how little we actually knew about these oil frontiers. And the fact, even though the price of oil is currently tanking, that in the next 35 years, 35% of the world's oil is going to be coming from offshore sources. And it's expanding off the coast of Vietnam and Thailand, in the waters of Greenland, in the salt shelf off the coast of Brazil, in the Jubilee elephant field off the coast of Ghana, and off the coasts of Sierra Leone, Mozambique, Australia, and China. In fact, everywhere where there's an ocean. And that was the kind of impetus for Offshore. We wanted to insert a reminder of the real materiality of oil and its effects on bodies and ecologies, the people and places of the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, we knew that no self-respecting oil company would give us access, although we tried. I did send letters to Shell and everyone else asking if we could get access to an oil rig, and the answer was predictably no. So we decided to build one ourselves. And that was a Spartan 2008. And when we went to Helios, that was the idea we went with, that we wanted to create an immersive experience that would give people some sense of what it meant to be on an oil rig. So do we want to show the oil rig?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So once you land on the oil rig, you're in the helicopter, and there's various little things that you can click on, which start telling some of the stories. And the evolution happened while my partner and I spent 6 months in Louisiana filming with fishermen, activists, locals. We were also busy designing the oil rig and going back and forth in terms of thinking about what the oil rig would actually look like and how to embed stories on the oil rig. Yeah, so maybe we'll go to the boat deck. So there's 70 minutes of content on this iteration of Offshore, and wherever there's an arrow means there's a video story that you can access. It has 360 sounds, so the idea was really to create a kind of design environment where the interface itself was telling a story. And this is one of the first stories from Darla.
There's more oil facilities than you can count. There's more than I can count, and I've spent my whole entire life out here. There are spots that you go out to that normally I used to be able to drive when I was a kid. We'd be able to drive straight. Now we have to zigzag through oil wells. Underneath here is like a road map of just pipes all over the place that you don't see, but if you got the map that showed you where all the pipes went, you would just be amazed. Because this may be the last year that we're coming out. I had to teach my son, who's 25, so that he can hopefully remember to teach the 7-year-olds when he's big enough when maybe something comes back, because I expected to just fall out and have nothing left. All we wanted to do is fish and be happy about what we were doing and feed the world. We fed the whole world. Our seafood went around the whole world. We're catching 10% of what we're supposed to catch. We can't survive. We can't pay our bills. We can't maintain our boats. I've been letting my husband go out because I'm now chemically sensitive. I can't go out in the toxic part. So he went out for 6 days, and he came back and he gave me what he made for 6 days. I normally make that in one night before BP.
So Mike is showing you the VR version of it, but in the original version, those videos would be full screen. So the VR gives you a kind of semblance of watching things, the video clips in a theater, while being more immersive in terms of moving around the interface, the 360 interface of the oil rig itself. So do we want to maybe go down the hatch, and then you can talk about some of the design elements behind the creation of this?
Okay. Well, actually, we'll go just straight down the hatch. I'm going to save that for a little bit later.
Okay.
I'm going to get ourselves there in the first place, over there. And I guess, actually, I'm going to start by going elsewhere, way back in time to 1933. King Kong was a movie I saw as a kid. About the King Kong. I don't think anybody needs to really have that explained to them. And hang on a second. Go. And I think, well, actually, I was here a couple of years ago, and I had a brief talk about the relationship that different people have in a project like this, and so that the traditional, as it were, that word, traditional model of a production is you have a designer, and then you have the filmmaker, and then you have the coder, and then you have like the producer, and then you have the people that give the monies to the project, and all those different inputs usually are, and actually to a certain degree, are siloed. And what I was talking about then was trying to remove the silo effect of those particular roles and to say that there is that a coder, as David, it's more than just love. It's actually part of the project. That coding actually can be creative, and that storytelling or filmmaking is actually they can be part of the interactive or the technical part of process of the project. That a producer actually doesn't necessarily mean or all about getting the monies, and the monies actually themselves can be creative in the stories. So I guess the long form of what I was trying to say then is still trying to say now, and I think a project like this and why we're showing this is that it is a convergence, I think, of all, or some of all the parts is greater than the sum. Or something like that. But in any event, what was really great with working with Brenda and other people that we worked with in the past is that quite often actually the filmmaker becomes more interactive than the coder, and then the coder becomes actually more fascinated in the filmic aspects. And I think this is something that I started talking to way back then, and I think we're sort of finally getting around to putting that theory into practice. And so here, for me, like this project, taking sort of like a classic example of a film, an old film, like King Kong. And there's elements in King Kong that, the cinematic elements that were super compelling. And we tried to bring into a project like this. So the idea of King Kong on this island, Skull Island, and it's a place that, it just breathes doom. And in the real world, if you saw that, you'd stay away. But in the virtual world or the world of storytelling, that's something that brings you in, that doom is alluring. And to not be there would be disappointing, boring. And so that was kind of one of our sort of like fundamental core touchstones of our sort of mutual storytelling and design thing, was to imbue a sense of doom, but without making it grim, and without actually making it kind of alluring, which is a kind of paradox, I guess. And Another aspect, and I think this is also has some relevance to this year's conference here in Barcelona, is the game aspect. And one thing that has always interested me, at least, is, and this is me being the non-filmmaker, fascinated by filmmaking, is the idea of a lens, and that a lens doesn't necessarily need to be a piece of glass on the end of a camera. In this case, it can be a code. It can be a bunch of code. It can be this interaction between me or the audience sitting in front of a screen, like we sit here, and what you see on the screen is still, in my mind, the process of a lens. And we'd done some work previously to working on this on a high-rise episode called 1 Million Tower, the 1 Million Tower, and that was like something that it all clicked for me, is the idea of a code camera, somewhere that you could actually look at something and get that feeling that you were actually looking at something. You could turn, you could zoom into something, you could do all the things that an ordinary camera could do. In a way, actually, you were sort of codifying filmmaking and making a new, different kind of lens. And so this is some of that aesthetic we sort of borrowed from High Rise and pulled into to Offshore. But then at the same time, another big influence was a game, and it's the only computer game that I have ever played and enjoyed. It's a game from 1992 or 93, I think, and it's called Myst. And it was one of the first games, David showed you one of the first games ever, which was like schematic stairs. This was one of the first games that used something that was close to like this, something real, that you looked at it and it had a sense of magic realism. And I remember playing this game and everything was still. And it was like this sense of silence and quiet, but you still heard some stuff. And everything was kind of like I said, still, but you had this sense of strange sense of movement, but also focus. And that was like something we kind of tried to borrow from that game and put into Offshore. And then through the process, though, what we didn't realize, and this was like after the fact, and that people were saying, well, you guys just made like a kind of cool, sort of weird video game. And it was, to us, a bit of a puzzle, but because we weren't trying to gamify the experience or the story. We were introducing gameplay elements into the experience, the audience experience, but not to gamify it. So I think that that's something that if we're using the word game or play in connection with storytelling like this, is to make a clear delineation between using elements of gameplay and gamifying. And gamifying is something else, and that's a much larger topic that we won't discuss now. And at this point, I guess we've gone through a little bit of the interface. So we're sort of a short circuit here. But what I'd also like to talk about is another influence on this, which was episodic, or in this case, TV that involved mystery. And was highly influenced by a TV show from the early 2000s called Lost. Everybody's stuck on an island, go figure, and it's a plane crash. Something bad is, something bad has happened on this island before. This is a mystery, and this also kind of informed the storytelling as well. There's this sense of mystery, but the cool thing about mystery is, and this is something we kind of figured out as we went along, is mysteries that aren't solved are way more powerful, I think, than mysteries that are solved. And this, actually, Lost is a perfect example of this. Season 6, everything gets explained, and it's boring. And so this was also something that we took into mind as well, is to bring up mystery into the story, but actually never explain anything, and keep the mystery alive. And so we end up at the hatch, and we end up with a mysterious foot to literally leave you with a sense of mystery. And we're going to go into a little bit more of the further iterations of the project, but I'm just going to show you actually here. It's just like sort of an example of some of the elements that we kind of pulled together. This is like actually a super fun process, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the idea, and I think this resonates with what David was talking about in terms of spatiality and interactive documentary. And the idea was that we wanted to create a labyrinth, and the labyrinth was a really important metaphor for us to think about, and that what would propel the user would be curiosity. So it's not, you don't get points for going through, there's no rewards at the end, but it does have to do with your own curiosity about exploring this particular space. And in the beginning, the labyrinth, we were kind of thinking of Greek mythology and Ariadne's thread and all the rest of it. And we actually did not have a map to the entire website. And I can't remember how many rooms there are, but there are at least 8 different rooms that you can go in and explore, and you'll hear different kind of stories. So for example, in the chemical room, you'll hear stories about people who had been poisoned by Corexit, which was the dispersant that BP had used to try to disappear the oil. In the boat room, you'll hear from, or the boat deck, which you saw a little bit of it, you hear stories of fisher people like Darla Rooks, whose whole livelihood had been completely destroyed. And we were shooting in 2011. And the case it's still the case that fishing hasn't been completely returned to pre-BP levels. It's still massively repressed because of the environmental disaster. So each of these rooms tells different kind of stories. When you go down, there's a collage of voices of the survivors of the Deepwater Horizon, and you get little glimpses of what that evening was when the oil rig blew up. But we did find out after doing some testing that without a map, people got very confused about how long they were supposed to stay in different areas, where were all the spaces. One of the spaces is our favorite space, or my favorite space, the ROV room. And hardly anyone was ever going to that. So that was when we came up with this idea of doing a map where you could actually tell which rooms you've been to and which rooms you could still explore.
So we're going to go into the ROV.
So the ROV, just to explain what that means, it's a robotically operated vehicle, and it's how, in the old days when oil rigs were only 50 feet in the water, you would send divers down to check on the well or repair leaks or whatever. Now, of course, when they're 2,000 feet below sea level, you can't do that. The water pressure is too great. So how they do operate is to use these ROVs, which are like little mini submarines, which go to the bottom of the seafloor and check out things. So we actually created an ROV that allows you to explore some of the bottom of the ocean. And part of these videos, too, was a lot of the videos are with people who live in the Gulf, but some of them were just purely visual, that we wanted to create this kind of sense of being there and what it was like to actually think about the long-term effects on the ecology of the ocean bottom. So that's what the ROV does. And this is footage of the actual well, the Macondo well that erupted. And then, do we want to go up to oil?
Okay.
Yeah. So you can exit the ROV room. There's other little videos that are embedded throughout here. And then you keep, as in a labyrinth, you keep going through various corridors and various doors to access different kinds of stories.
Oops.
Sound? Sound? So that was an example of some of the clips, the video clips that we used were more purposely kind of experimental and immersive. And that one in particular was done, those aren't the deep water rigs, those are shallow water rigs. But we wanted just to give people a sense of the population of shores with these rigs. One of the things that we did, we had always thought, or rather I had always thought, that what was important to me about the deep water was to think globally about how our oceans, which connect all of us, are being exploited in the interests of offshore oil. And that we had started to work with journalists and filmmakers in Alaska, Ghana, and Brazil, three major petro frontiers where oil exploitation at that time, it's been a little repressed now because of the tanking price of oil, But at that point, we're really proliferating. And originally, we were going to put all of these stories in the first interface, the interface of the oil rig, and it was just getting way too confusing in terms of the lack of geographic unity. So what we decided to do was to do a separate interface that would be connected to the first, but that would allow this kind of spatial unity of stories from Ghana, Brazil, and Alaska to tell the story of the proliferating international frontier of oil. So this is, as I said, this was launched in 2015, and it allows you to also access stories from each of these areas. It was done as a collaborative project with various activists and journalists in each of these locations. So maybe we could just show one clip from Alaska. Where is
Okay.
We've seen it already with the boom and bust cycle of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. People went to work and had big bucks, and then all of a sudden those jobs were over and there was nothing. I saw what it costs the village. I saw the social change of hardship that people go through when their traditional foods are ripped out from underneath them. They had put in causeways to allow oil and gas development to occur on the nearshore environment. They told us, don't worry, we're going to maintain these causeways. It's going to protect the fish migration. Over 8 years, we watched the Arctic Cisco harvest decline. They brought in hundreds of flights, seismic activity, in which caribou were diverted from completely around the village. When you have the young hunters who are losing their harvest because now they're having hundreds of helicopter flights flying over them and you can't get that harvest. You deal with anger and frustration. There were a lot of hardship. People started having problems with domestic violence. There was a number of people that were losing hope, and there was a lot of drinking that was going on. There were a number of people that were attempting suicides. When you impact a community with no resources, no jobs, no assistance for a food bank, what are people to turn to?
So just before Mike talks about this part, one of the interesting points about the collaboration, too, coming from linear documentary, is when we started out, we thought, oh, the video clips will be 5 to 10 minutes. And Helios said, well, what about 30 seconds? And so it was really this process of trying to work out how you could do storytelling without losing people and making sure you're still having a non-linear experience, but that you're getting a sense of environment, these very different environments in Alaska, Ghana, Brazil, et cetera. And so over the process of working with a series of editors, we ended up doing, they're about 1.5 to 2 minute long story lines for each of them.
But now that we have you educated on the 1.5-minute thing, I'm actually rethinking the idea, and I would like to explore long-form storytelling, but that's for another day. But what we had also had done, and this was a project we were working on simultaneously with this, a project for the Red Cross, where we started to use data and mapping and how to make interactive maps that were actually somewhat interesting or fun or did different things, and we sort of discovered this this way. Somebody else had actually worked on it, and this is like one thing that coders can do as well, is steal from other coders, and it's called open source. And so an open source mapping technique that changed the borders of countries with their the input of data. So for instance, here we have a standard worldview map, and we could start pulling in oil use statistics and theoretically change the shape of the world or the countries so according to its oil use. Like, for instance, there we have the United States, the greediest country probably in the world, all of a sudden inflates to like a gross part of its size. Then we sort of plug in GDP, and then the countries, interestingly enough, don't change. So, but we'd say climate change vulnerability, and then we see that the poor countries and the countries actually that use less oil actually are growing. Oil exports. That's sort of interesting as well too. That again, a lot of these poor countries are the ones that are growing, and oil imports. No surprise there, and oil reserves. And that's sort of really interesting that some of the poorest countries in the world, and the ones that are most vulnerable to climate change, are the ones that are actually have the largest amounts of reserves still untapped. And this is like the thing that I guess that has been a global concern is it's not the stuff in the air that's the problem right now. It's not the stuff that's in the gas tanks right now that is the problem. It's the stuff that's still in the ground. And the grand irony of this statistic is that it's all under the poorest and the most vulnerable countries in the years to come. But we move on to VR. Okay. So
I just want to say, though, that the project, I work in a university, and this project was funded by a federal grant, Social Science and Humanities Research Council, which is this amazing program in Canada that funds scholars doing work in universities. And in particular, they had a program called Research Creation, which allowed you to do more experimental digital work. And so that was the funding. It didn't have television funding. It didn't have any of that kind of funding. It was really a process of experimentation. And that was what was being supported.
So last summer, I got an email from the curator at the Bergen International Film Festival, BIF, and they were that's in Norway, and they were really interested in showing the project. But I was saying, well, it's kind of old. It's a year and a half, 2 years old. It's a bit old. This was the old version, like the one we were showing you before, and we had this idea saying, well, would you like us to give it to you as a VR? And they said, sure. And so what we did the next couple months was to convert all the work that we'd done for the web experience into a VR experience. But the important thing here for us, which was the reason why, and was and still is, like the main reason we have reservations about VR is the non-openness of it. We've spent like 5-6 years working on I mentioned that word, open source, projects where you can borrow code, you can borrow ideas, you can do, as we heard earlier, a collage of text and images and graphics and sound, and for us, taking that away and putting this into a headset, into a proprietary software, and to make it an experience that can only be experienced at places like InterDocsBarcelona, was a problem for us until we kind of stumbled on this idea, or this technology called web VR, and which allows VR to play through a web browser. And then you add on to it another level of complexity, which is you introduce the idea of responsive VR. And we've heard of responsive code, which allows a website to be played on a smartphone or tablet onto a computer screen. And it adjusts itself accordingly, and that's what the idea for responsive VR does. It detects what kind of device you're looking at it. So if this was, like right now, it's saying, oh, this is a computer, so it's giving us the computer version. But if we hotwire a little bit, now we're looking at it in the cardboard version. So if we looked at this with an iPhone or an Android, we'd see it with our Google Cardboard. It splits it into a stereo output, and if we looked at this in an Oculus rig, and David's not the only one with bugs. Sorry. you'd experience this as a full Oculus experience. So what we found too was that at least on a sort of development level, what was it still actually had that element of collage, that we could still bring in these panoramic images that we'd built for the initial experience. We could build in an even sort of more elaborate and cool sound design, and we could also bring in sort of elements of 3D and 3D models and kind of make it all more cool, I guess is one way of putting it. So, for instance, here, these dossiers or these redacted documents, when you're looking at this in the headset, surround you. So you have this I guess it is completely and utterly immersive. And for the actual exhibition itself in Bergen, we can't do it here, but this was our VR version, which people were looking at it like this in their headsets, was actually linked up to a full screen like this, so that people in the audience, like you, could see what I was seeing, like me, with the headset. So it was this sort of inversion of what is virtual and what is immersive and what is the experience. So it was also our way of trying to open up, the hitherto sort of closed VR experience. So gave us some good ideas, and actually with a lot what VR is about, it's quite addictive. So you can spend a whole year saying VR is shit, and then the first time you actually do it or see it or actually build something, you become a bit addicted. So I guess I'll leave it at that, as I'm an addict.
It's also, I remember the first time I looked at the VR version and wearing the Oculus, and we have elements on the original site where you can go down the hatch, and it does become like a roller coaster. So you are much more immersive, and there's a complete bodily change as you're navigating your way around it, because you are there. It's not just you watching it as a user. It does create a really different kind of experience.
I'll try and pull it up, actually.
Okay.
And one thing that we did, I'll show just a little bit. This is sort of still kind of the boring technical parts, but I think what would be cool is actually, I'll leave it to with our explanations to show you actually one element of like unadulterated sort of VR shit, so that you can actually see, because quite often people experience and they say 360 film. What is 360 film? What does it actually look like? And the risk of digressing, which I'm good at, I'm going to show you what 360 film looks like. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people here that have seen what 360 film looks like outside of a sphere. But I think it's kind of cool just to see, the little films behind. Okay, so there we are. Maybe not. Hang on a second. Oh yeah, there we are. So here we go. You saw, you remember when we went down to the boat way back when? So this in effect is like 10 seconds of 360 film, and what happens is that gets wrapped onto a sphere virtually, and we're using code, and so this is like the still getting back to that idea that we were saying before, the idea of the lens can be more than just a piece of glass. It can be a piece of code, much like 360 film can be more than just somebody with like a big GoPro rig. In this case, it was like a poopy little 3D program on an iMac at the office. We built this 3D virtual space and had our little 3D virtual camera outputting something like this. So for us, for this whole sort of process, is still this idea of sort of collage of not only techniques, but of ideas and actual medium. It's kind of cool. And I think, have we done?
Do you have anything? We have about 1 minute left.
We have 1 minute left. What should we say in 1 minute?
I could say that we just posted a study guide, and it is being used extensively in Ontario as part of the grade 9 curriculum, and that was kind of one of the inspirations for using a gaming aesthetic, was to try to get a younger audience interested in this. And so we've been doing kind of sort of teach-in sessions with geography teachers, and who have started to use it in there, because everybody has to do a sustainability unit in grade 9, and the response has been really fantastic, that the kids really like it. So that was absolutely gratifying in terms of outreach to a different kind of audience. Okay. So I think our time is up, and we'll be having questions with...
1 second, we're going to leave with... No, we're not. Okay, we're done.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brenda and Mike. Nice project, nice presentation.